The year was 1886, and the dust owned everything. It owned the cracked earth of Cora Prescott's farm, the faded gingham of her dress, and the silence in the house where her husband's laugh used to live. Grief was a physical presence, a second shadow that clung to her even when the Arizona sun beat down with a fury that bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue. The farm, once a testament to shared dreams with her late Arthur, had become a monument to her failure. The well was low, the north pasture was fallow, and the mortgage payment, a spectre in a tailored suit named Mr. Callahan from the bank in town, loomed larger than the mesas on the horizon. Cora's days were a litany of hard, thankless chores. She moved with a grim economy of motion, her body lean and corded with a strength that belied the hollowness in her chest. The loneliness was a constant, howling wind, even on the stillest days. She spoke only to her remaining livestock, a handful of chickens, and a stubborn old mule, her voice, a rusty thing from disuse. The world had contracted to the boundaries of her land, a kingdom of sorrow and dust that she was slowly, inevitably, losing. Each sunset painted the sky in hues of bruise and blood, a daily reminder of the beauty she could no longer feel, a promise of another night spent staring into the oppressive dark. The town of Redemption was a 2-hour ride away, and she made the trip only when necessity screamed louder than her desire for solitude. The townsfolk treated her with a cloying pity that felt more like judgment. They saw a widow in over her head, a problem to be solved or, more likely, to be swept aside. Mr. Callahan, the banker, was the worst. He had a way of looking at her land, his eyes gliding over the fields not with a farmer's hope, but with an investor's hunger. He spoke of foreclosure with a regret so false it was insulting, his words slick with the oil of manufactured sympathy. "A woman alone can't manage a place this size, Cora," he had said on her last visit, his thumb stroking the lapel of his fine wool coat. It is no shame to admit defeat, but it was a shame. It was a betrayal of Arthur, of the life they had built with blistered hands and boundless love. Admitting defeat felt like letting him die all over again. So she held on, fueled by a stubbornness that was all she had left of her former self. She ate little, slept less, and worked until her muscles screamed, and exhaustion granted her a few hours of dreamless oblivion. She was a woman dwindling, shrinking under the vast, indifferent sky, her spirit eroding particle by particle, like the dry soil carried away by the wind. The farm was her anchor and her millstone, the last remnant of a life of love and the stark evidence of her current desolation. She was not living, she was simply waiting for the end of a story she already knew by heart. It was on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of heated steel, that they arrived. They did not appear suddenly, but emerged from the heat haze on the horizon, a slow and deliberate procession that seemed to rise from the land itself. 6 figures on horseback, moving with a fluid grace that made them one with their mounts. Cora watched from her porch, her hand instinctively going to the worn stock of the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. Strangers were rarely a blessing in this part of the territory. As they drew closer, she saw they were Navajo. The man in the lead sat straighter than the others, his face a testament to seasons and sorrows she could not imagine. His hair, streaked with silver, was bound by a simple cloth band. His eyes, dark and deep-set, missed nothing. He carried an air of quiet authority that was not proclaimed but simply was, as natural as the mountains. Behind him, 5 younger men followed, their faces ranging from the stern focus of early manhood to the lingering softness of youth. They were alike in their proud bearing and the quiet watchfulness of their gaze. They stopped a respectful distance from the porch, their horses shuffling in the dust, the creak of leather the only sound in the weighted silence. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Fear, ingrained and immediate, warred with a flicker of curiosity. These were not raiders. There was no aggression in their posture, only a profound and unsettling stillness. The leader dismounted, his movements unhurried. He was tall, and the lines on his face told a long story. He approached the porch steps, halting at the bottom, his eyes meeting hers directly. There was no threat in them, but there was an intensity that stripped away all pretense. "I am Hosteen," he said. His voice was low and resonant, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "These are my sons. Ashki, Sani, Bidzil, Kuruk, and Lonan." He gestured to each in turn, and each son gave a slight, solemn nod. Cora's hand tightened on the rifle. "What do you want?" Her own voice was sharp, brittle. Hosteen's gaze drifted past her, taking in the sagging porch rail, the cracked paint on the house, the tired expanse of the land beyond. He saw it all, not with the predatory assessment of Mr. Callahan, but with an ancient, knowing sadness. He understood land, and he understood struggle. "This is good land," he stated, a simple fact, "but it is weary, like its keeper." A flush of anger and shame burned Cora's cheeks. "My farm is no business of yours." "Perhaps," he conceded, his calm unruffled by her hostility. "We have been displaced from our own valley. The government moves us to land that will not grow corn, to water that will not sustain sheep. My people are hungry." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the hot, dry air. "We are looking for a home, a place to put down new roots." Cora stared, her mind struggling to grasp his meaning. "This farm is not for sale," she said, though the words tasted like a lie. "It would be Callahan's soon enough." "I do not wish to buy your land," Hosteen said. "I wish to borrow it." He then laid out his offer, his words chosen with deliberate care. He and his sons would work the farm. They would repair the fences, deepen the well, and plant the fallow fields. They would bring their own small flock of sheep to graze the north pasture, their manure enriching the tired soil. In return, they asked for a place to live, the old abandoned line shack, and the use of the barn and a share of the harvest. Not half, not even a third. Just enough to feed their family and trade for what they could not grow. The rest, and the farm itself, would remain hers. He would also give her $10 silver a month from the sale of their woven blankets to help with what he called the paper man in town. Cora stood in stunned silence. It was an offer of impossible generosity. It was salvation, arriving on horseback, speaking in a low, calm voice. But it came from a source she had been taught her whole life to fear and mistrust. The people in Redemption would be scandalized. They would call her a traitor, or worse. The whispers would become a roar. Callahan would surely use it against her, painting it as proof of her incompetence or moral failing. She looked from Hosteen's unreadable face to the 5 younger men. They watched her, their expressions as impassive as their father's. They were a world unto themselves, a wall of silent, waiting strength. To say no was to surrender to Callahan, to the dust, to the end. To say yes was to step off a cliff into a future she could not possibly imagine. It was an exchange of one kind of fear for another. She looked at the cracked wood of her porch, at the dry fields shimmering under the sun, at the ghost of Arthur's hand on the railing beside her. What was there left to lose? "The line shack is small," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The roof leaks." Hosteen's mouth tilted in the barest suggestion of a smile. "We know how to fix a roof." He had not asked for her trust, or her friendship, or her approval. He had made a practical offer to solve a practical problem. It was an arrangement of mutual survival, stripped of all sentiment, and in its stark honesty, Cora found a strange, solid thing to hold on to. "All right," she heard herself say, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "All right." The first days were a lesson in silence and space. Hosteen and his sons moved into the dilapidated line shack at the far end of the property, and it was as if a silent, efficient force of nature had been unleashed upon the farm. Cora watched from a distance, a sentinel of suspicion posted on her own porch. The men worked from before sunrise until after sunset, their movements economical and purposeful. They spoke to one another in their own language, a flowing, quiet music that Cora could not understand, but which conveyed a sense of seamless cooperation. They never approached her house without reason. If they needed something from the main barn, it was always Sani, the practical-minded second son, who would appear at her back door, his hat in his hands. He would state his need in clipped, careful English, "Ma'am, we need the post-hole digger," and would wait, his eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder, until she nodded her assent. He never lingered, never offered small talk. The space between her house and their world was a chasm of culture and history, crossed only for the most necessary transactions. Cora's routine, once a solitary march of overwhelming tasks, was now strangely empty. She found herself watching them work. She saw Ashki, the eldest, his powerful shoulders moving with a steady rhythm as he reset the fence posts that had sagged for a year. She saw Bidziel, the strongest, single-handedly maneuver a massive rock from the field they were clearing for a new corn patch. The two youngest, Kuruk and Lonan, worked with the flock of sheep they had brought, their calls to the animals soft and coaxing. Hosteen himself seemed to oversee everything, his hands as busy as anyone's, his presence a quiet center around which everything else revolved. They did not work like hired hands, they worked like men tending to their own blood and bone. The rifle remained by her door, but her hand rested on it less and less. The initial fear began to curdle into a complex stew of resentment and reluctant admiration. They were fixing her farm, bringing it back to life with a skill she had never possessed. They were succeeding where she and Arthur had been failing even before he fell ill. The rhythmic thud of their hammers was a constant reproach to her own inadequacy. She felt like a guest in her own home, a ghost haunting the edges of a life being rebuilt by strangers. One evening, a week after their arrival, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, a violent, purple beast that tore across the plains. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and rain fell in solid, blinding sheets. Cora stood at her window, watching the deluge, and her thoughts went immediately to the line shack and its leaking roof. She imagined them huddled inside, their belongings soaked, and a strange, unfamiliar pang of concern tightened her chest. It was an unwelcome emotion, a crack in the wall of her detachment. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The next morning, Cora saw Hosteen and Lonan on the roof of the shack, expertly patching the holes with materials she hadn't known they possessed. Later that day, as she fed her chickens, Lonan approached her. He was the youngest, with eyes that still held a measure of open curiosity. He held something out to her in his cupped hands. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. "For you," he said softly. The storm broke a branch from the cottonwood. "The wood is good." Cora stared at the gift, her fingers hesitating before taking it. The wood was smooth and cool against her skin. It was a simple thing, a piece of scrap wood transformed by patient hands into something beautiful. It was an offering that asked for nothing in return. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling thick in her throat. Lonan simply nodded and walked away, rejoining his brothers. Cora stood there for a long time, the wooden bird clutched in her hand, feeling the first tentative thaw and the ice of her heart. The weeks bled into a month, and the farm began to breathe again. The fences stood straight and true, enclosing pastures where the new grass, encouraged by the Navajos' careful tending, was beginning to grow. The corn they had planted stood in neat green rows, a vibrant promise against the brown earth. The well, deepened by Sani and Bidziel's tireless digging, now offered water that was cool and clear. The sounds of the farm were changing, from the lonely cry of the wind to the bleating of sheep, the low murmur of men's voices, and the steady rhythm of work. Cora's observation of the family shifted from suspicious scrutiny to a quiet, daily study. She began to learn their individual currents. Ashki was the silent anchor, his presence steady and reassuring. Sani was the engineer, his mind always working on the mechanics of a problem. Bidziel was the gentle giant, his immense strength always applied with precision and care. Kuruk was the artist, the watcher, who saw patterns in the clouds and the earth that others missed, and Lonan was the bridge, his youthful openness, a tentative link to her own guarded world. Hosteen remained an enigma, a man of deep reserves and profound dignity. Cora saw him sometimes at dusk, standing alone at the edge of the mesa, looking out towards the east. She wondered what he saw there, the home he had lost, the future he was trying to build from the ashes of his past. In his stoic silhouette, she recognized a reflection of her own loss, a grief as vast and silent as the land itself. It was a kinship she felt but could not yet name. The rigid separation between the house and the line shack began to soften at the edges. One sweltering afternoon, Cora found herself baking bread, the familiar motions a comfort. On impulse, she baked an extra loaf. When it was cooled, she wrapped it in a clean cloth and walked the long path to the shack. She felt foolish, her heart thumping with a nervous uncertainty. She left the loaf on the small, rough-hewn table outside their door and retreated without being seen. The next morning, on her own back stoop, she found a small pail of rich, fresh sheep's milk. No words were exchanged, but a new language was being formed between them, a dialogue of bread and milk, of shared labor and unspoken respect. Slowly, cautiously, she began to join them. She started by bringing them cool water in the fields, a gesture they accepted with solemn, grateful nods. Then one day, she picked up a hoe and began weeding a row of corn alongside Kuruk. He didn't speak, but he adjusted his rhythm to match hers, and they worked in a companionable silence that was more comfortable than any conversation she'd had in years. The shared work became the soil in which a fragile trust began to grow. They were no longer just the Navajos, they were Hosteen, Ashki, Sani, Bidziel, Kuruk, and Lonan. And she, in their quiet, respectful presence, was beginning to feel like more than just a widow. Her mandatory trip into redemption for supplies was now fraught with a new kind of dread. The first time she went after Hosteen's family had settled in, the whispers were a palpable force. She felt the eyes on her back as she walked into the general store. Mr. Weston, the proprietor, measured her out flour and salt with a new coolness in his manner. The town's matriarch, Martha Donovan, saw her on the street and crossed to the other side, gathering her skirts as if Cora's very presence might soil them. The prejudice was a thick, suffocating fog. In town, they weren't Hosteen and his sons, men who worked harder than anyone she knew. They were just Indians, a faceless threat, and she was the woman who had let them onto her land. The scandal was a delicious morsel for the town gossips. Mr. Callahan was waiting for her outside the bank. He tipped his hat, but his smile was a predator's grimace. "Morning, Cora," he said, his voice oozing concern. "I've been hearing troubling reports." "My farm is fine, Mr. Callahan," Cora said, her chin high. "In fact, it's doing better than it has in years." "Is that so?" He glanced down the street, as if to draw the attention of any listeners. "I hear you've taken on some rather unusual tenants. A woman living alone, surrounded by savages. It's not a good look, Cora. People are worried for your safety, for your virtue." The insinuation was as foul as rancid meat. A hot, fierce anger, an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time, surged through her. "They are good men," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "They are honorable men, which is more than I can say for some." Callahan's smile tightened. "They have no rights here, you know. They are wards of the government, squatters on your land. A word from me to the Indian agent, a word to the sheriff about the propriety of the situation, and your little arrangement could end very quickly. And then where would you be? The bank has been very patient, Cora, but our patience has its limits." The threat was clear. He was using her new life, her fragile hope, as a weapon against her. He wanted her land, and he would use the town's bigotry as his crowbar to pry her off it. She rode home that day with his words ringing in her ears, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The peace she had begun to find was a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the hatred of the world beyond her fences. When she got back, she saw Hosteen watching her approach. He must have seen the trouble in her face. He said nothing, but that evening, as the sun set, he walked to her porch. It was the first time he had come to her house for a purpose other than stark necessity. "The paper man made you afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. Cora sank onto the top step of the porch, the fight draining out of her. "He means to run you off," she said, her voice flat. "He'll use the law, the sheriff, people's fear. He'll say I'm not fit to run this farm, and he'll take it." Hosteen stood for a long moment, looking out at the fields his sons had reclaimed. The cornstalks were knee-high now, a testament to their labor. "This is good land," he repeated, his voice soft but unyielding. "We have put our hands in this soil. Our sweat is in it. It is becoming our home." He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a strength that seemed to draw from the earth itself. "We are not so easily moved." His words were not a promise of victory, but a statement of intent. He would not run. He and his sons would stand their ground, and in that moment, Cora knew she had to make a choice. She could retreat into her fear, let Callahan win, and lose everything, not just the farm, but this new, tentative sense of belonging, or she could stand with them. She looked at the carved bird Lonan had given her, which now sat on her windowsill. She looked at the neat rows of corn. She looked at this dignified, resolute man who had shown her more honor than anyone in redemption. "No," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "We are not so easily moved." The word "we" hung in the air between them, a newly forged thing, strong and resonant. The battle line had been drawn, and for the first time in a very long time, Cora Prescott was not on it alone. The banker did not wait long to make his move. Less than a week later, 3 riders appeared on the road to the farm. Cora recognized them instantly. Sheriff McBride, a man whose spine was as flexible as his political ambitions. Deputy Miller, young and eager to please, and leading them, with an expression of smug triumph, Mr. Callahan. They rode not with the urgency of lawmen, but with the slow, deliberate pace of vultures circling. Hosteen's sons stopped their work in the fields, gathering in a silent, watchful cluster near the barn. They held their tool shoes and shovels butt in their hands. They looked as formidable as any weapon. Hosteen came to stand on the porch beside Cora. He had not said a word to her since their conversation, but his presence was a bulwark. Cora's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but a cold, clear resolve had settled over her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. "Cora," Callahan called out as they reined in, his voice ringing with false authority. "We've come on official business. There have been complaints, serious ones." Sheriff McBride shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, avoiding her gaze. "Now, Cora," he began, "this is just a wellness check, you might say. We have to look into these things." "What things, Sheriff?" Cora asked, her voice steady and loud enough to carry. "The fact that my fences are repaired, that my fields are planted, that this farm is finally producing again." Callahan sneered. "Don't play coy. You're harboring squatters, vagrants. It's a dangerous situation. For your own good, and for the good of the community, we're here to escort these men back to the reservation where they belong." He produced a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "This is an eviction notice, legally filed on the grounds of misuse of property and public nuisance." Cora felt a tremor of panic, a legal document. It felt so final, so powerful. She looked at Hosteen. His face was a mask of calm impassivity, but his eyes were like hot coals. He was waiting for her to lead. This was her land, her fight in the white man's world. She took a deep breath, the dry air searing her lungs. She thought of Arthur, of his belief in the law, in doing things the right way. He had taught her more than she realized. "That notice is predicated on a lie, Mr. Callahan," she said, stepping forward to the edge of the porch. "These men are not squatters. They are my employees." A ripple of surprise went through the 3 men. Callahan recovered first. "Employees? What are you paying them with, Cora? Dust? We both know you're bankrupt. I am paying them with a share of the crop and the use of the line shack and pasture, as is my right as the landowner, Cora stated, her voice gaining confidence. We have a verbal contract, which is as binding as any written one in this territory. And I have also been receiving a monthly cash wage from them, for my own use. She looked directly at Sheriff McBride. $10 silver a month. The first payment was made last week. I believe that makes them legal tenants as well as employees. You have no grounds to evict them. Callahan's face purpled with rage. She's lying. It's a desperate trick. Am I? Cora walked back into the house and returned a moment later, holding the small, heavy cloth pouch Hosteen had given her. With deliberate slowness, she untied it and tipped 10 shining silver dollars into her palm. The coins glittered in the harsh sunlight, each one a small, solid fact. Here is the proof. This is an economic arrangement, Sheriff, a private business matter between myself and my partners. The word hung in the air, audacious and undeniable. She had not planned to say it, but it felt right. It felt true. Sheriff McBride looked from the coins in her hand to Callahan's furious face, then to the 5 silent, imposing figures by the barn. He was a politician, not a crusader. He could sense the shifting ground. Evicting legal tenants and employees based on the town's prejudice was a messy business, one that could cause him trouble he didn't need. Well, Callahan, the sheriff said, clearing his throat. A tenancy agreement, even a verbal one with payment rendered, that does change the legal standing. This seems to be a civil matter, not a criminal one. My authority here is limited. Limited? They're savages, Callahan sputtered, his composure shattering. You're just going to let this stand? I'm going to uphold the law, McBride said, his tone turning firm. He had made his calculation. And the law says this is between Mrs. Prescott and her tenants. Let's go, Callahan. He turned his horse, his relief palpable. The deputy followed suit without a word. Callahan was left alone, his face a mask of thwarted greed. He glared at Cora, his eyes venomous. This isn't over, he hissed. You've made a grave mistake. The town will never accept this. You'll be an outcast. I've been an outcast since my husband died. Cora shot back, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. The only difference is, now I'm not alone. He stared at her, then at Hosteen, who had not moved a muscle. Defeated, Callahan wrenched his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. Silence descended, thick and profound. The immediate threat was gone. Cora's legs suddenly felt weak, and she gripped the porch railing for support. Hosteen turned to her, and for the first time she saw a new light in his eyes, a deep, unwavering respect. He gave her a single, slow nod. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, acknowledging her courage, her strength, her victory. Down by the barn, his sons straightened up, and Ashki raised a hand in a brief, silent salute. The battle was won. They had stood together, and they had held the line. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively. Callahan's defeat became a story in redemption, one that muted the most vicious gossip. While few in town suddenly became enlightened, Cora's fierce public defense of her arrangement earned her a new, grudging respect. They still saw her as strange, but now they also saw her as formidable. The outright hostility subsided into a wary distance, which suited Cora just fine. Her world was the farm, and that world was thriving. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of shared purpose and quiet companionship. The boundaries that had once seemed so stark and impassable had dissolved, worn away by shared sunrises, shared meals, and shared struggle. The house was no longer just Cora's, it was the heart of the farm. The men would sometimes join her on the porch in the evenings, their conversation with each other a low murmur in the twilight, a comfortable sound that filled the spaces once occupied by lonely silence. Cora learned more of their story, not from grand pronouncements, but from small pieces shared over time. She learned that Hosteen's wife, a master weaver, had died the winter before, a loss that still shadowed his eyes. She learned that Sunny had a gift for healing animals, that Kuruk drew stories in the dirt with a stick for his younger brothers, and that Bidziel, for all his strength, was terrified of snakes. They, in turn, learned of her life with Arthur, of their dreams for this land. She spoke of him not with the sharp agony of fresh grief, but with a gentle, healing nostalgia. They listened with a quiet reverence, understanding that a place is made of memories as much as soil. The farm flourished under their combined care. The corn grew tall and heavy with ears, and the small flock of sheep multiplied. They dug irrigation ditches, channeling the precious water with an ingenuity that amazed her. The land, which had been on the verge of dying, was now a tapestry of vibrant life. It was no longer a monument to loss, but a testament to resilience. One cool autumn evening, as the first chill of winter hinted on the breeze, Cora found Lonan sitting by the creek, carefully mending a small tear in one of the family's beautiful woven blankets. She sat beside him, watching his nimble fingers work. "My mother taught us all to weave," he said without looking up, as if continuing a conversation they had been having for years. She said it was like telling a story. Each thread has its place. If one is weak, the whole pattern suffers. He looked at her then, his young face serious. "You are a strong thread, Cora Prescott." Her breath caught in her throat. To be seen not as a fragile widow or a scandalous outcast, but as an integral part of a pattern, a strong thread in the story. They were all weaving together. It was a gift more precious than silver dollars or a bountiful harvest. It was the gift of belonging. That winter, the snows came deep, blanketing the mesas and silencing the world. But inside the small farmhouse, there was warmth and light. Hosteen and his sons had insulated the old house, making it snug against the wind. They shared their meals at her long wooden table, a new and unconventional family forged in dust and defiance. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet comfort of presence, the soft clink of cutlery, the crackle of the fire. They had faced the judgment of the world and had built a sanctuary, a home. Cora looked at the faces around her table, the wise, weathered face of Hosteen, the strong, steady faces of his Sonson knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was no longer losing her farm. She had finally, truly found it.